Welcome back, episode 3, folks. Today we're talking all things muscle. This will actually be the second draft because the first time I recorded this about an hour ago, the audio was completely disconnected. So maybe that means a little bit better thought process today, too. Who knows? But we're talking muscle today for a couple different reasons. The main thing is because I think there's a lot of controversy surrounding the topic of why it's important, how do we get it, how do we optimize it, all of these different things. But then number two, there's a lot of, in my opinion, misinformation, disinformation, whatever term you want to put on it, that really misguides a lot of us or has misguided many of us for decades. And unfortunately, now we're in a culture where there's all these different schools of thought that just battle each other, and there's not really much practical advice for many of us to latch onto. And it can feel disheartening to have the goal of trying to build muscle for competition or just your own health and fitness and longevity, but not really have much guidance to go on, right? A lot of people will end up, unfortunately, just quitting or falling off of their fitness journey because they don't feel like there's much guidance there. So that's the topic of focus today is, why is muscle important and how do we optimize how much we have and how much we keep, and what's the best way to really get it in the first place. So first of all, the main thing I wanted to talk about is muscle is extremely adaptable and active. It's really an organ, and I use that term intentionally because when we think organs, many of us will think of things like your visceral organs, your heart, your lungs, pancreas, these sorts of things. A lot of times we don't think of muscle as that. We think of it primarily just as either an aesthetic piece, right, where it just gives off an impression of how fit or healthy we might be, or it's just used for mobility, right? It's just used to help move our bodies certain ways. And both of those things are definitely very valid. I'm certainly not anybody to bash the aesthetic side of things. I think that's awesome, like the idea of bodybuilding and competing in that world or aesthetic modeling. I think is great because there's a lot of work and dedication that goes into that, just like any other sport. But honing in on the idea of fitness, health, longevity, all of these things, there's a lot more to muscle than just the aesthetic side of things. It's extremely active, as I mentioned. It's going to be one of the more active, metabolically active tissues in our body. Pound for pound, actually, if we look at glucose or sugar, kind of the basic energy building or energy supply in our body, uh, our brain tissue actually is going to be probably the most metabolically active when it comes to glucose metabolism. But muscle is right up there as well. I mean, we're constantly taking sugar from the blood, borrowing it from the liver when we need it, in certain instances, and storing glucose in our muscles so that we have energy to get through not just our day-to-day activities, but also our fitness routine. But it's extremely important to help regulate blood sugar specifically. I mean, that's one of the more obvious ways that it can really maximize our health and our fitness long term. We see this in literature as well. It's not necessarily an independent manager of things like diabetes, but it can be a very critical step in terms of either preventing or managing the treatment of type 2 diabetes specifically because of that constant utility of our blood sugar and making sure that we're not having high levels of sugar in our blood that are then circulating consistently and unfortunately can lead to things like insulin resistance and then diabetes down the road. So that's one of the more obvious things. We're also going to get a certain class of chemicals released called myokines, and essentially what those are different categories of cellular markers, things like anti-inflammatory markers, brain-derived neurotropic factor, all from the contraction of muscle tissue. So literally, when you squeeze your muscles and repeatedly, if you do that to a certain level of stimulus, you're affecting your entire body. You're affecting your brain. You're affecting your nervous system. You're affecting your inflammatory system as well. All because you are squeezing your muscles. I mean, it sounds kind of basic. It sounds almost too simplistic, but there is really that much power in just simply the act of repeatedly contracting your muscles over and over again. And of course, you'll get a little bit more benefit out of that depending on how much you do, um, uh, in terms of the contraction intensity and frequency and duration. But point is, we get all of these different benefits out of muscle tissue, and I think a lot of it is underappreciated for how that carries through our whole lives. I like to put muscle tissue as in financial terms. almost because I think it's maybe a little bit more relevant or applicable, maybe a little bit more tangible for many of us to appreciate. Muscle tissue is really your long-term investment for your health. This is your retirement account for your health, essentially. Just like you would start saving, ideally, at a young age for your retirement, financially, 401k, Roth IRA, whatever. Muscle tissue is that for your longevity, your fitness, your independence. The main key difference, though, is that with your retirement fund, you can theoretically accrue, as much money as the stock market allows and as you can deposit into it. There's not necessarily a cap per se, and obviously there's going to be some technicalities. Please don't, CPAs get on my case here. I'm not that kind of page. I'm just speaking in general terms. Muscle tissue, unfortunately, has as a cap that starts really as young as about 30 for both men and women, meaning that if we look at your entire lifespan, what is the most amount of muscle tissue that you can maintain or ever have at one period of time? Approximately 30 years old is going to be that cap for most people. And that's shocking to many people to hear, right? You might think that it would happen much later in life, that, maybe, if you train consistently, that you can keep all your muscle from 30, 40, 50 years old, and then it doesn't really start to affect your health or your mobility until you're 70 plus years old, past retirement age. And that couldn't be further from the truth. It happens at a very young age. So really the question becomes, okay, how much do you want to invest in your retirement fund for health? Do you want to focus on muscle early in life and maintain as much as possible so that you can have all of these different health benefits we talked about? Does it prevent chronic disease, prevent frailty, prevent, the need for dependence on your mobility or not being able to live in your own home because you have not enough strength or power to actually move throughout your day? Or do you want to take the time to invest more time, energy, finances, whatnot, into your health early on to make sure that you store up or create as much storage of that muscle tissue that will then last throughout the rest of your life and positively impact really every factor of your life, not just the physical, but also the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, all of that. Right? I mean, unfortunately, that's something that I've seen in healthcare, especially as a physical therapist, is the emotional toll and the spiritual toll that it can take on individuals when they're in a situation, whether it is normal age-related changes or if some accident or illness occurs and they've now lost their dependence or they have lost their ability to move about their lives, move about their house if they're even in their own home. And it's not to say that they could have 100% prevented all of that by having more muscle tissue, but the research is very clear that your recovery from those types of things is much better and faster when you have more muscle tissue compared to when you don't. And building that muscle early on is something we all have control over to a certain extent. Now, genetics, of course, will play a role, right? Your genes, your cellular makeup is not something that we can necessarily change 100%. I mean, there's the idea of epigenetics, which would be that we can, with activity, turn on and off, an environment can turn on and off certain genes. I'm not going to get into that, mostly because I'm not an expert in it, but point is, there's going to be a certain limitation we all have. I could train with the on paper best program in the world, the best nutrients, the fanciest weights, equipment, all of this. I am never going to be the biggest person in the gym. I'm never going to be a professional athlete size wise. I'm never going to be like Myles Garrett, right? If you guys watch football, he's a specimen. Okay, the amount of mass on his body is something that 99.999% of the population is never going to get, even if they do train well, but they can certainly do much better than if they don't train at all, right? And then the nice thing or the cool thing is it doesn't take as much variability in terms of the training as we might think. It doesn't take like a magic recipe or a magic formula for training. It really just takes time, consistency, and effort, as we'll get into here. And that's something that we can all dedicate if you want to, right? If it matters to you, which as a PT and fitness expert, I hope it certainly does, at least to some extent. So, we've talked about all of the different health benefits, why it's important, why should we care, why does any of this matter? But then the other category, the other side of things is, well, how do we get any of that, right? How do we build muscle? How do we maintain muscle? How do we, prevent it from breaking down faster? We can't, of course, prevent time and biology from occurring, their whole entire lives. We can certainly slow the decline of that muscle mass being lost, and it doesn't take, again, a super complex plan. So one of the key things that I like to go over with clients, and that I think most people in general, out in the world, out in your commercial gyms or whatnot, are going to maybe have struggle with, is the idea of intensity and how much intensity that we need to build muscle, and then also what does it feel like to actually push yourself to an intensity that requires muscle building. Traditionally, we've thought, and kind of the old school thought is that if you want to build muscle, if you want hypertrophy, right, we break down the idea of hypertrophy, which just means muscle mass building or size increase, that we need a certain rep range, right? Some sources might say 8 to 12, some might say 12 to 15, but within a certain rep range of your exercises, that is going to be best for hypertrophy, or that's where you're going to get hypertrophy. Versus if you want strength, if you just want to be able to move more weight, okay, now we need a different rep range, right? If the old school thought would be that, if we hit 8 to 12 reps, we're not going to get stronger, but we'll get bigger. Versus if we do something like 4 to 6 reps, we'll get stronger, but not bigger, right? And so we kind of treated these different constructs in silos, and we talk about them as if they are separate, they don't interchange or interrelate. And over the last, 5 to 10 years, especially, but probably even a little bit longer than that, we've seen from the research that that actually is very far from the truth as well. And the cool thing is that your body is going to adapt to a wide variety of stresses in a very similar manner. Meaning, if you want to build muscle and you want to build strength and you want to have all these health benefits, you don't need to train at a super heavy load of like 80+% of your 1 rep max. Maybe you're not comfortable with that for whatever reason. Maybe pain limits you. Maybe it's a fear-based thing because you've never tried that. I, again, totally respect that just on a professional level. Again, everybody's perspective on that is going to change or be different. But you don't necessarily have to box yourself into certain numbers. If you're more comfortable training at 20, 40, 60%, a little bit lighter weights, that's totally fine. But there is one variable that is across the literature pretty consistent as far as being able to get stronger and gain muscle mass that we need to have in place. And that's the idea of intensity. We have to have a certain level of intensity to really stimulate and force your body to change. Our bodies are amazing devices, creatures, whatever term you want to use for it, and they are going to get very comfortable at whatever we ask them to do. And so if we ask them to stay at a place that we're comfortable with, that we know, that we're familiar with, keeping weights the same, rep schemes the same, all of that, we're probably not going to challenge ourselves enough to actually change or really incentivize our muscles specifically to develop or to change or grow, right? So we need to be able to push ourselves to a point where it essentially forces our muscles to adapt, right? We have to kind of convince them strongly that they need to get bigger, they need to get stronger, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to handle future stimuli that we're going to place upon them through our workouts, right? So this idea of being able to elicit the right amount of intensity is key. And the research again shows that we really just have to get within maybe 2 reps or so approximately consistently of failure, and failure being a true mechanical inability to complete the rep. So let's take bicep curls, right? It doesn't just mean failure, meaning when it starts to get hard or you feel a muscle burn. If anything, that's like the start of maybe what we should start paying attention to. It means truly I cannot physically, with as much mental power as I have, I cannot get my arm to lift up to move that weight and complete the rep. That is failure. You're not going to get the best results by doing that consistently, training to failure consistently. But if you're within maybe 2 reps or so approximately, 2 to 3 days per week of that, and you train that consistently, then you will start to, over time, start to see the benefits of building more muscle and building more strength. Now, going back to the idea of failure, that's another kind of old school thought that, for many years we've thought that, well, if we push ourselves to failure, if we just exhaust the body, exhaust the muscles, that will force it to grow. And you certainly can get stronger. Not to say that that's going to be harmful, that you won't get the benefits you're looking for. But we then have to look again at a practical lens, because research is not so much hinged towards practicality. We really are just trying to answer one specific empirical question, which in a lot of these studies is, can we build muscle with failure or not failure? And the answer is yes, you can. But then if we zoom out, okay, how do we apply that to somebody's busy life and extend it over months and years and decades? Training to failure, especially multiple days a week, is typically a good recipe to overtrain or create injury, because you're not just affecting your muscle tissue, you're affecting your tendon, you're affecting your bone tissue, obviously, and you're addressing your nervous system, which I think oftentimes gets pushed by the wayside and gets forgotten about. But this is really affected by everything, not just your training, your sleep level, your nutrition, the stress in life in general, even if it's outside of the gym. Maybe it's work related, relationship related, all of these different things. If you compound all of that with the idea of every day or multiple days per week completely frying out all of these systems to failure, you're probably going to become slowly overtrained, and you'll probably start to see your numbers decline, your motivation decline, pain may likely increase because you're not allowing your body to recover. And many people can become discouraged and think, well, this whole strength training thing isn't for me. It's just not working. I'm going to give up, and they quit. And so one of the main things I want to again touch on is the right idea of intensity is needed. If you want to build muscle, you need to create a stimulus that forces your body to change to build muscle. What is that stimulus? Again, based on the literature, approximately 2 reps or so away from failure. If you can get specifically 1 to 2, if you're familiar with what true failure feels like, I would encourage you to aim there for multiple sets per week. If you're shy of that, 3 plus, again, depending on how familiar you are with training. If you're a novice just starting out, you still may get some benefit out of that. But if you're experienced, if you've been lifting for well over a year consistently, and you're staying 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure every time and not getting close to that, you're going to struggle much more with trying to build muscle and build strength. So we need that intensity. The other piece to talk about, though, is how do we get there and how do we know what is the right intensity? And the research is also clear, too, that more novice lifters are going to have a harder time to know exactly how many more reps they have until their failure compared to those who are more familiarized with training. And that makes complete sense, right? Think of failure in general as maybe an unexplored territory, wherever you're at, indoors, outdoors, whatever. If you've never been there, if you don't know what it looks like, you're not going to know exactly how far away you are from it, right? From failure. This is kind of an unfamiliar territory compared to somebody who's been there before. They've failed reps before. They know exactly what does that feel like mentally and physically for me to get to a point where I truly cannot move the weight anymore. That more experienced person is going to have a much better idea of knowing exactly how many more reps they need to get to a point of failure. So from a practical standpoint, if you're not familiar with that or you're not quite sure maybe how that applies to you and you're listening or watching, pick a movement in the gym, preferably machine based, just safety wise. You don't want to take back squats, and first time ever failing is when you have 100 pounds or more on your back and you're in an open gym, and safety hazard, obviously. So pick something like, machine based bicep curls or leg press, something like that, where if you fail, machine's going to keep you safe. And pick a weight that you can start moving with relative ease, not something you could do 1,000 times because that'll take forever, but something you think that you could pretty reasonably do 10 times with a good burn. But don't stop at 10. Just keep going. Maybe you get to 15, maybe you get to 20, maybe you do get to 30, 40, 50 reps. But either way, you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to learn a lot about yourself physically and mentally because you're going to explore new territory of getting close to failure or reaching failure that maybe you didn't realize you had. And for a lot of folks I've talked to or worked with, that process is enlightening because they then realize, like, man, maybe I've been holding myself back for a couple years because I thought that I was getting close to failure. I thought I was pushing myself, but then I did this one exercise or this one initiative, and I actually did like way more than I realized I could, right? And that's a very, sometimes at the moment discouraging process because you might feel like, I've been wasting my time. But in general, I really hope that that's more encouraging and more enlightening and positive because now you realize, like, oh, look at all this potential that I have left to really improve myself, right? Don't look back and say, oh, all of that was a waste. maybe all of that was just a time to learn to get to this point. So now you can really take off on all of your progress, right? You can't change the past, but you might as well optimize the future. So that idea of intensity again is critical. We have to be able to push ourselves to a level of fatigue or near fatigue, so that our body actually we create a stimulus for our body to actually adapt and build that muscle tissue. The other question then is volume. How much should I train? How often should I train? Your muscle tissue is going to need recovery. I mean, if we look at the literature specifically for connective tissue, so this would be like our tendons, not so much the actual muscle bulk part. Your tendons will get thicker. It's outside the scope of the video here. Those will adapt as well. But if we're talking just muscle tissue, as is the focus, that's going to probably recover a little bit faster than the collagen or the connective tissues. But from that literature, you're typically about 48 hours or so, at least, is going to be needed for full collagen resynthesis and recovery. And so, depending on the level of intensity you do, let's pick a near failure set or workout. I would typically suggest somebody not use that muscle group at least for the next 2 days or so, maybe even 3, because you want more recovery at the structural level. And then again, also neurologically, you want a little bit more recovery too. So, um, using that idea, 2 to 3 days per week, excuse me, is going to be ideal for most people. As you get more familiarized with training, 4 days per week, maybe up to 5, but now we start getting into the idea of, well, how do we create different splits and work our body system, our muscles and joints differently? You certainly would not suggest 4 or 5 days a week doing the exact same movements and training the same muscle groups at a high intensity every time, because that will likely lead to overtraining and fatigue and injury and all these different things. So you can certainly resistance train or strength train, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 or 7 theoretically days per week, but your intensity is very much going to be different on those days. So we'll speak just to the practical sense, not so much the recovery days or the active recovery days or whatever term you want to use for it, but what are the really meat and potato kind of days as far as strength training and muscle building? Again, going to the literature, the less experienced you are, the more sets per week you'll probably have to build muscle mass and strength, versus as you become more experienced, a year or 2 plus into consistent strength training, and then beyond, then you'll start to need even more sets per week. Your body's going to adapt to the bare minimum, and then you have to push it a little bit more. But typically speaking, for the novice individual, about 6 to 10 reps per week is actually probably an adequate stimulus to start to build muscle tissue and muscle mass, more than doing nothing, of course. 1 set, 2 sets per week, we're probably not getting enough stimulus, but really as few as maybe 6 to 10, creeping up towards that 10 level to be ideal, is probably going to create an adequate stimulus for change. As we get more into the intermediate and more advanced, now we're going to start looking at more, close to 16 to 20 sets per week for specific muscle building qualities. But again, even that depends on, what intensity we're working at, what is the overall volume within the set, a lot of different factors at play. But this gives you a rough idea. Now, how does that look again in the grand scheme of a workout plan? Let's say you take 3 days per week to strength train, and you're aiming for 12 reps. Let's say you're, maybe a year into it or so. 12 sets per week at 3 days per week. That's 4 sets every time that you're going for one muscle group, right? 4 sets for a muscle group is hardly anything, truly. I mean, that's one exercise that you're doing. Should you probably do more than just one exercise? Yeah, because you're not really going to maximize your time and your growth if you're only doing one exercise every strength session. But I say that to illustrate how it doesn't necessarily require that you spend 3 hours a day, 5, 6, 7 days a week in the gym doing strength training. As long as you are using that intensity piece we talked about, and on those sets that you are performing the exercises, getting to near failure, that more than likely is going to be adequate to at least maintain or ideally build muscle growth, right? You have to push yourself, but you don't have to push yourself for hours and hours and hours a week. Again, if you're a high level individual, you're a more professional athlete or striving to be a professional athlete, of course your requirements are going to be different. I'm speaking more to the general populace here. But if your goals are very different as far as, well, I want to be the top 0.01% of whatever field, then you're going to have to put in 0.01% amount of quality of effort. And that's a different subject a little bit. But for the general person, it's very manageable, actually, time-wise and volume-wise, to get to the level that's needed to build muscle and build strength. And then the other piece, of course, being exercise selection. And going back to old school thoughts, and this is one thing that I really struggled with, especially in high school, as I first started to get into the idea of resistance training and trying to be stronger for sports and just life in general, is that I was very much surrounded by and inundated with this concept of muscle confusion, right? I think if anybody's been in the space, casually, professionally, whatever, you've heard that idea and that belief that, well, we need to constantly vary our exercises. We need to constantly, confuse the muscles as far as what activity we're doing, because if we do the same thing over and over again, then our muscles adapt and then we don't make progress. We have to like sneak up on it. And there's some benefit certainly to variability, but it actually doesn't have to be as variable as we think, or that traditionally we have thought. The idea of muscle confusion as far as exercise selection really is not well founded. I mean, again, research shows that we can be very consistent in our exercise selection, and at that right intensity we've talked about, right, approaching near failure consistently, we can do the same exercises and we will force that muscle over time to grow within the capacity of its genetic makeup. Right? We don't have to have 45 different exercises for one muscle within a month or 2 months for it to grow. We can do the same thing over and over again. Now, speaking practically, most of us are probably mentally going to become fatigued or drained or lose motivation from having the same repetitive exercise over and over again. And that makes complete sense, right? Many of us require a different stimulus. We don't want to feel like hamsters in a wheel just doing the same thing over and over. Some people do thrive in that, and that's great. If that's you, go for it. Keep sticking with that routine. But on the mental side of things, with maintaining your motivation, then there certainly is value in switching up your routine and creating some variability. And there's a lot of different exercise options out there that will work a similar muscle group. So it doesn't even have to mean that, well, I got bored with this movement, so that means I have to rest that muscle group now for a month or 2 months until I gain the motivation back. No, you can work the same muscle 100 different ways, right? But it doesn't have to be the exact same movement necessarily. If you want to do it that way, great. From a rehab perspective, I do think that there is some benefit in creating a well-rounded program. And when I recommend programs, just going anecdotally based on my experience, when I create programs, I'll typically not go longer than 4 weeks doing the same movements for clients. Because I do think that we get some benefits physically as well from an injury prevention standpoint to give certain tissues a certain degree of rest and sort of share the load evenly. But from a muscle building perspective and hypertrophy and strength building perspective, you can certainly stick to the same limited movements if you'd like, and you'll gain as much strength and volume as is possible for your muscles, again, within their genetic makeup. So that piece as well is something that I think has been maybe pushed a little bit negatively in a negative manner, meaning that we've confused a lot of ourselves by saying that we have to have this variability, this muscle confusion idea, and it's not necessarily founded in the literature. The last piece is nutrition, and I won't go all in on this because, number one, it's not necessarily my scope. I mean, I'm not a registered dietitian. I don't have an advanced degree in nutrition at all, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be the expert in that. But I have gotten certifications and I can read the literature, and I've been in this space long enough to know very convincingly that when it comes to optimal nutrition for muscle protein synthesis, I think it doesn't have to be as complicated as we oftentimes make it. And unfortunately, with the way that our health and fitness space has become has become capitalized, and everybody's got a different niche, and there's expert and guru for everything, and You've got the carnivore people up against the vegan people, up against the high carb, low carb, all these different kind of tribalistic groups. This idea of nutrition can feel very competitive and like you're getting yanked everywhere. But if we just stick to the idea of protein and muscle building synthesis, typically about a gram of protein per pound of body weight for most people, especially active people, is going to be ideal to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis, meaning that you can get the most benefit out of your nutrition if you are aiming for that level approximately. Now, if you're, maybe 10 to 15% above or below that, that doesn't have to be exactly 1.00 on the mark every single day, but it gives you a good idea. And most people in this country, in the American diet especially, are going to be drastically under that. I mean, this is something else that really surprised me when I was, towards the end of my college career. I had been playing football and wanted to lose the weight that I had gained because I felt like I would just be healthier, and I realized that, man, everything I had been eating and using to quote unquote bulk was really not a good bulk because, yes, I was gaining weight, but a lot of the food that I thought was high protein, while it was also extremely high in fat and additional calories that I did not need. I'm not here to demonize fat. We need that for recovery and cellular function and all that. But point is, I did an audit of my diet and really became surprised by, okay, here's actually what I'm eating. And I wasn't getting as much protein as I thought anyway. A lot of why I was full after a meal was because of all of the excess calories from the significant excess in fat that I was eating. And so because I'd audited it, switched things up, diet is now much leaner and I feel better, and I'm much more inclined towards the direction that I want to go for my goals. But again, I would encourage you all to really do that process as well. Go through that audit and see how little or maybe how much protein you're actually eating. If you're like me, you're probably on the lower end, and maybe you're eating more of some other nutrient that you want. It's not necessarily to say that you have to have a certain type of food that you're always eating. I am very much a creature of habit when it comes to nutrition. I've said this before, but I view food as fuel. I enjoy a good tasting meal, love to go out to eat and all that. But for me, just throughout the weekly routine, it's much easier to do the boring meal prep, chicken, rice, green beans, whatever, mix it up, and make some meals throughout the week, because that way I know, okay, exactly what I'm eating and I'm hitting these values that I need to. And then occasionally, on the weekends, for example, kind of splurging or going off track with that intentionally, which, as a side note, is also, I think, helpful to emotionally and mentally just sort of rest and recover, right? Too, versus stressing constantly about all the calories and the nutrients that you're eating. But muscle building wise, we want to maintain an adequate protein intake, and then fill in everything else with fats and carbs according to how much energy you're spending and what energy systems you're tapping into. Again, beyond the scope of the video here, the episode today. But make sure you have enough protein, and that you're actually hitting those numbers, because if you're not, you're going to significantly hinder, even if you're working as hard as possible, hitting all the intensity and frequency and exercise selection variables that we talked about. If you're not refueling with the proper sources and you're not giving your body what it needs to actually physically build that muscle tissue, then all those other variables can become at least less relevant, potentially completely irrelevant. And then sleep, of course, too. We need adequate sleep. We'll get into that maybe at a future episode, but you need to recover. So don't go out and train every single day for 5 hours a day, maxing out 7 days a week. It's a good recipe to overtrain, potentially lead to pain and get discouraged. Make sure that you're recovering, you're resting, challenge your body 2-3 days a week with multiple sets per muscle group to near failure. Eat well and live with the results, and then stay on track, guys. It takes time. A lot of times you're going to gain strength when you first start out very quickly. A lot of those changes are neurologically driven, right? If you just start a lifting program and you're a month or two in, you might notice like, oh yeah, every week I keep getting stronger. This is easy. This is no big deal. And then after that, those neurological changes start to slow down, which is totally normal. But if you're not familiar with that idea and nobody's really warned you that that's going to happen, a lot of times people can become discouraged. Then months 2 to 6 and beyond feel a lot slower, feels like I'm going nowhere. And that's not a you problem, most likely. That is just a matter of you need to stay consistent with it and appreciate that this doesn't take just an overnight process. The most successful people, the healthiest people I know, are the people that make all of these different decisions, habits that they stick with long term. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't just brush your teeth for a year or two out of your life and say, well, I did that for long enough, so now I should just have the benefits for the rest of my life. You got to stick with it and stay consistent. If you put so much pressure on yourself that you can't maintain it, because we all have a limit and we all have scheduling conflicts and time, effort, motivation, all of these different factors are part of being human. If we don't account for all of those different things, it's more than likely that we're going to fall off track and not make progress simply because we didn't stay consistent with whatever plan or program we're on. So all of the different variables we talked about today, find what works best for you, that you can stay consistent with and that you can maintain over time, and really invest heavily into that fitness account that we call muscle tissue.